Okay, so take number two. Welcome back to Critical Weight Theory, where we dive into the stories, sounds, and cultural moments that have shaped current events and history. And in this case, it's music history. Today, we're talking about an album that didn't just change the game, it rewrote the rules of what rock music could be. I am talking about the Beatles' 1967 masterpiece, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. So, some of you can already hear Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, just by my mentioning the album title. And that's a sign that you might have a classic album on your hands, where even if you're not the biggest fan of the album, you still know something about it, right? You know, if you've listened to rock music at all, or maybe even if you're not somebody who regularly does, you probably have heard Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. And that kind of already makes it easier to understand the context of the album because it's just that influential. You've probably heard of it, and you've certainly heard of the Beatles. So, to understand why this album was so groundbreaking, we need to place it in its time, at least partially. It was the summer of 1967, the height of Beatlemania, and what we call the summer of love. Countercultural moments were thriving, and music was becoming a very important way to express those ideas. Enter the Beatles, already icons, but still hungry to innovate. And this was, in some ways, one of the first parts of the concept album revolution, or at least the trend. Maybe revolution would be too strong of a word, but it definitely helped spawn the trend of the concept album, which was definitely an important part of rock history. And really, it's still a concept that you see today in even modern music. One of the defining features of Sgt. Pepper is indeed its concept, even though it's not a strict narrative. The album is often credited as one of the first concept albums. It's a very influential piece of history in that regard. From the opening track, it invites listeners into the world of Sgt. Pepper's fictional band, creating a surprisingly cohesive, immersive experience that was certainly groundbreaking at the time. And Paul McCartney described their approach in Mark Lewison's The Complete Beatles Recording Sessions. He said, quote, "We would say try it. Just try it for us. If it sounds crappy, okay, we'll lose it. But it might just sound good. We were always pushing ahead, louder, further, longer, more, different." End quote. So that experimental mindset became a hallmark of the album and really a key part of, the music of the 1960s, psychedelia and experimentation. Of course, the Beatles did not exactly invent experimental music, or especially not experimentation in art overall. I mean, that goes back, since people have been creating art and music. But nevertheless, this is one of the sort of obvious moments where studio innovation really came into play, and it helped pave the way for a lot of albums that would follow in its wake. Producer George Martin, often called the fifth Beatle, also played a massive role in shaping the album's sound. The studio became an instrument in itself, with groundbreaking techniques like multi tracking, tape loops, and orchestration that would sort of weave through the tracks. You know, it was a it was a real innovative approach to making an album. These methods created lush, textured soundscapes that listeners had never heard before, and that's really part of the theme here that I want to emphasize. It's it's not like I'm saying, this is my favorite album of all time, or, that it has to be your favorite album. But, if you respect the context, it's it's going to change how you view it. So if you listen to A Day in the Life, for example, it's important to remember there really weren't songs that sounded quite like that before. And it's a sonic journey blending orchestral crescendos with haunting melodies, pushing the boundaries of what a rock song could be. And it was also a catchy song too, so that's really another thing you need to keep in mind. It was not just like experimental and weird or whatever, but it was also a catchy song, which is really not that easy of a thing to do if you're trying to be innovative while still having an appeal to a large audience. So it was really an example of genre bending mastery. And this album it's definitely genre blending. Tracks like Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, help shape psychedelic rock. And of course, since then, we've had psychedelic forms of all kinds of different genres. I'm sure there's even psychedelic country you could point out. And while others borrow from classical music, other tracks on this album, and avant garde experimentation, I think one of the things that people will most gather from the album is that it's definitely a psychedelic rock album. The result is, something that expanded the very definition of rock music. And, you know, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, it's also a legendary song because people will associate it with drug use. LSD is even what a lot of people believe the title represents, Lucy Sky Diamonds. And, you know, that alone, that song alone actually had a cultural impact. It is a part of rock lore, and it's similar to like Puff the Magic Dragon, which people wrongly associate that with drug use, but it's become larger than the song itself. The idea that if you listen to Puff the Magic Dragon, it might be like having a drug experience, an experience with Mary Jane. You know, a lot of these types of things, they become immersed in the rock lore. They become legendary in a way. So it wasn't just the music that made Sergeant Pepper a cultural phenomenon. You have to keep in mind its release coincided with the countercultural movement, becoming an emblem of the era's values. From the colorful fashion inspired by the album cover to its influence on the Summer of Love, it became more than just an album. It was really part of a movement in a way. And you might also see it tying into other songs like that song San Francisco, be sure to wear flowers in your hair, and things like that. It's just really tied in with the 1960s and that whole time. Of course, there was, critical acclaim that, a lot of people don't really care that much about, but nevertheless, it received critical acclaim. From what I understand, it won 4 Grammy Awards, including Album of the Year, and it's still hailed as one of the greatest albums of all time. By challenging conventions and embracing innovation, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band set a new standard for artistry in rock music. It's because of albums like this that a lot of people out there, when they try to come up with a new concept for an album, they might say, well, we have to, you know, do something with a psychedelic vibe or make it more orchestral or whatever, just to play around with genres, and things like this kind of pave the way for that. So that's the basic story of Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. It's not just an album; it's a milestone, and there's a lot of power in experimentation and collaboration. If you haven't listened to this album before, or haven't heard it in a while, now's the perfect time to revisit the uh, the sounds that they captured. It really does sometimes seem like if you're a musician, you're just capturing the sounds that were flying past you through the air, you know? So, anyway, I've said enough about it. Thanks for tuning in to Critical Weight Theory, and I'll see you next time for another dive into music history, or maybe we'll talk about a movie or a TV show or a social issue, any number of things. So, yep, peace and love and all that jazz.